Under the blazing sun of a summer afternoon, the small town of Montauban seemed peaceful, almost too calm. The inhabitants moved about without haste, enjoying the enveloping heat as if the routine of the city suffered no disturbance. The children were playing under the watchful eye of their mothers. The men were chatting over coffee on the terrace, and the old ladies were walking slowly, their straw hats flapping in the light breeze. Everything seemed idyllic. But Zahara knew that beneath this quiet surface, something lurked, something invisible, like a shadow hovering over the city. She, a 38-year-old black woman, was not here to enjoy the calm of summer. She was on a mission for the Ministry of Justice, sent for a discreet investigation. His role was apparently simple: observe, analyze, and above all, remain invisible. But as is often the case in his profession, the reality was much more complex. Zahara was used to blending into the background, being forgotten. But that day, a strange feeling persisted within her. She had the impression that the city was watching her in turn, as if every movement of her body attracted hidden attention. This wasn't the first time Zahara found herself in a city where she was seen as an outsider. But that day, something seemed different. Her footsteps echoed strangely on the cobblestones, as if everyone knew she didn't belong there. The furtive glances of passers-by seemed to brush past her without ever stopping, but Zahara felt their presence. The way people looked away when she met their gaze, or the small conversations that suddenly ended when she approached a group, all of this gave her an uneasy feeling, as if she were not welcome. She sat on a wooden bench under the shade of an old oak tree, a notebook in hand, silently writing down her impressions. The air was heavy, charged with a stifling heat that seemed to want to slow down time. The sounds of the city, usually so familiar, mingled with the whispers of the wind in the leaves. Everything seemed calm, too calm. But Zahara felt that the city, with its clean streets, neat facades, and well-tended gardens, hid a secret she was determined to uncover. She observed the people around her, analyzing every detail. An old woman walking slowly with her shopping bag, a young mother holding her son's hand, a man in a crisp suit adjusting his sunglasses as he crossed the square. Everything seemed ordinary, but Zahara knew that every little detail could be a lead. She scrutinized the gestures, the expressions, the little flaws in this too perfect setting. Suddenly, 3 police officers in dark blue uniforms appeared, patrolling the square with a uniform gait, their presence imposing an almost immediate silence. Their eyes instantly focused on Zahara, as if she were an anomaly in a landscape too perfect to be true. She felt them even before they approached, like a tension in the air tightening around her. The streets seemed to have frozen. She knew what was going to happen. She had experienced it many times. A black woman alone, taking notes in a public place. This never went unnoticed. Remaining calm, she showed no nervousness, her body perfectly relaxed. His posture was relentless. She knew that in this kind of situation, the slightest weakness could be seen as a sign of guilt. The police officers approached, and one of them, a hard-faced man with features marked by a life of service and an imposing mustache, stood directly in front of her. He looked at her for a moment, then said in a cold voice, as if he had pronounced a judgment, "Your papers, please." Zahara slowly looked up, her calm, almost menacing gaze locking with the officer's. She was unfazed by the aura of authority he was trying to project. "For what?" she asked simply, her voice betraying no fear, only a cold question. A slight frown marked the officer's surprise, but he did not let it destabilize him. "Your papers now." His voice was firmer, more insistent. A request that was gradually transforming into order. The atmosphere in the square suddenly changed. The ambient noise of conversations, children's laughter, footsteps on the pavement died away, as if someone had cut off the audio of the scene. The passers-by, taken by surprise, stopped. Eyes focused on Zahara, some intrigued, others silent judges. None dared to intervene. They watched, as one observes an imminent accident, hoping that the worst would not happen. Zahara felt a dull heat rise within her, but she remained calm. She knew that every gesture, Every word would be analyzed. His silence, at that precise moment, was his greatest strength. "I'm just sitting here enjoying the afternoon like everyone else," she replied in a measured tone, her eyes still fixed on the officer. "I don't see anyone else being called out like this." Another police officer, younger, moved a little closer. His blonde hair was cut short, and his gaze betrayed a certain hesitation. Maybe he didn't really understand what was happening. Maybe he was just carrying out orders. "We don't want to create a problem," he said in an almost conciliatory tone, but the order in his words left little room for discussion. "Show your papers, and that's it." Zahara observed the two other police officers. Their attitudes strengthened. The gazes of passers-by intensified, although they did not move. Zahara felt the electric tension in the air. Each second that passed reinforced the idea that she was a spectacle, an object of analysis, a test for the social order of the city. But she wasn't there to conform to other people's expectations. She wasn't there to let it happen. Suddenly, the third policeman, a massive man with a red face with anger, approached with heavy steps. He burst out in a hoarse voice, "You think we don't know what you're doing here? A black woman alone taking notes? You're up to no good, huh?" The response, as brutal as it was predictable, made Zahara burst into cold anger. She didn't let herself be overwhelmed, but there was a glint of challenge in her eyes. "A black woman, that's it, right?" she called out, her voice dry, her gaze hardening as she confronted the injustice of the words. The officer moved forward, his imposing figure looming towards her, a menacing gesture in his eyes. "Enough talking. You come with us to the station," he ordered, without further formality. Without warning, the policeman's hand suddenly landed on her arm, grabbing her firmly, pulling her from her bench. The metallic sound of handcuffs clattered through the air, contrasting with the silence of the place. Zahara's wrists were suddenly trapped, the cold of the irons an affront she felt deeply. One last look. A final overview of the scene around her. Shocked faces, shifty eyes, indifferent looks, but no act of solidarity. No action to prevent it. It was as if everyone knew, in a tacit knowledge, that this kind of situation never ended well for a person like her. Zahara stood up, her head held high, her shoulders straight, her body relaxed despite the handcuffs. She allowed herself to be led without resistance. If the town of Montauban had a secret, it would discover it, but it wasn't that day. Today, she was the victim of another secret, that of the latent racism that permeated every alley and every look. And she knew that the only way to make it burst was to never let it happen. At the police station, the humiliation was total. Zahara felt like an object, displaced, worthless, and reduced to her status as a stranger in this city where everything seemed to point to her. She was pushed into a stark corridor with grayish walls, lit by flashing neon lights that cast a cold, harsh light. The lingering smell of stale coffee mingled with that of disinfectant, a combination that seemed to embody the oppressive atmosphere of this place. The policeman's footsteps echoed on the dirty tiles, and Zahara felt confined, a feeling she knew well, but which was no less unpleasant. The police officers took her unceremoniously into an interrogation room. The room was stark, empty except for a metal table and a few chairs. Nothing here seemed designed to inspire trust or collaboration. A mismatched piece of furniture and a one-way mirror on the wall added to the heavy atmosphere of the place. They placed her facing the table, without courtesy, without any consideration for her status, her rights, or even her dignity. The interrogation began almost immediately, the police stationing themselves around her like predators, confident in their power and control. "Who are you, and what are you doing here in Montauban?" the officer with the imposing mustache asked, his voice authoritative, almost disdainful. Zahara remained impassive, an expression of absolute calm on her face. She knew every word could be used against her. "My name is Zahara Ndiaye," she replied in a measured tone. "I am a French citizen, born and raised in Lyon. And I see no reason for you to treat me like this." The police officers exchanged a quick glance, then burst out laughing. The young policeman, still uncomfortable but visibly bolder now, said mockingly, "French with a name like that? Let me laugh." He leaned forward a little, as if he had just discovered a bad joke that he couldn't contain. Ndia? It doesn't really sound like a French name. Zahara did not let herself be destabilized. She knew that this type of remark was not new, but she was determined to remain calm, not to give in to provocation. I'm here to uphold justice, not to cause trouble, she said with implacable coldness, her eyes staring unflinchingly into those of the police officers. But you, gentlemen, are making a serious mistake. The silence that followed his statement was heavy. The police, who had initially been implacable, now seemed slightly perturbed. The laughter had stopped, and the tone had changed. The youngest of them, visibly still adjusting his certainties, cast a furtive glance at his colleagues before whispering to one of them, "Perhaps we should investigate further before continuing like this. We could be making a big mistake." His words, although discreet, were loaded with doubts which, like cracks in a concrete wall, began to shake the certainty of the police officers. But the officer with the mustache, visibly furious at seeing his authority called into question, suddenly turned towards him. His face instantly hardened, and he raised his voice, not to respond, but to crush any form of resistance. "Shut up. Don't start doubting now," he growled, his eyes full of contempt. "You know we don't need her story to know what she's doing here." Zahara felt the tension rise in the room. The policeman with the mustache, apparently satisfied with her reprimand, turned towards her again, but this time he looked more threatening, almost accusatory. "So tell me," he said in a more acerbic tone, "why are you here, really? What is your goal in Montauban?" Zahara does not flinch. She knew this question went far beyond her name or her presence here. It was an attempt at intimidation, a way to make her lose her composure, to push her into confessing to something she hadn't done. But she wasn't there to be manipulated. "I already told you why I'm here," she replied calmly. "I'm investigating, nothing more." The other police officer, the one who had shown hesitation, seemed to want to intervene again. But the look his colleague gave him, heavy with silent threats, quickly dissuaded him. Zahara was alone against them, but she was not weak. She knew that in a situation like this, she had to hold on, stay upright, and never let anxiety overwhelm her. The interrogation continued, but the police, although trying to maintain their authority, seemed less sure of themselves. The youngest, lost in his thoughts, moved slightly away from the group, taking one last look at Zahara, perhaps a look of humanity that he did not dare fully express. As for the policeman with the mustache, he gritted his teeth, looking for new questions to make her bend, but he knew, deep down, that he had no control over her. And that was perhaps the greatest humiliation of all. He knew he was dealing with a woman he couldn't break, no matter how much humiliation he inflicted. Zahara didn't give in, and in the back of her mind, she knew she would eventually find the truth behind what they were trying to hide. The heavy silence in the room was heavy, almost palpable. Each second seemed to stretch indefinitely, as if time itself wanted to stop, to reflect on what was happening, on the error that was unfolding before the eyes of the police officers. Zahara, for her part, did not let herself be moved. She knew that the mistake was already in progress, that they had embarked on a path from which it would be difficult to return. In their arrogance, they were trapping themselves, trampling on fundamental principles, believing that their power could erase everything. But Zahara left them no escape. Every word she spoke, every silence she maintained, strengthened the vice around them. "I'm not here to cause trouble. You're making a big mistake," she repeated, her voice clear, but filled with determination. It was then that a rushing sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor before a door suddenly opened. A man in a suit came rushing into the room, holding a cell phone and looking at it worriedly. His face was marked with nervousness, and his frantic behavior betrayed great urgency. He approached the police office without even greeting them, visibly in a hurry. "We have a problem," he said, his voice shaking, as if just being here might make him guilty of something much more serious. The policeman with the mustache looked at him, taken aback by the sudden appearance of this man and by the nature of his message. He straightened up slightly, his eyebrows furrowed, and asked in a cold tone, "What else?" The man in the suit stammered, clearly panicked, She's from the Ministry of Justice. She was sent by... The shock was immediate. A heavy silence followed his words, a silence that seemed to encompass the entire room. The police officers' gazes fixed on Zahara, their faces falling at the thought that they had attacked the wrong person, that they had targeted the one they should have protected. The handcuffs that still glowed around Zahara's wrists seemed to symbolize this irremediable mistake, a burden they could no longer ignore. The older policeman, the one with the imposing mustache, stood frozen, his eyes desperately searching for a way out. The other police officers, panicked, began to exchange furtive glances, but none of them seemed capable of finding a solution to this situation. Their certainties crumbled in the face of the inevitable reality. Zahara, still calm, slowly stood up. She stared at the man in the suit, then at the police officers, a cold but determined look. "You will have to face your mistake," she said, without emotion, but with such force that it was impossible to doubt the truth of her words. The man in the suit immediately rushed towards her, almost embarrassed at having to carry out an act that he had clearly wanted to avoid. He clumsily removed the handcuffs, letting them fall onto the metal table with a sharp thud. Zahara stared at them for a moment, her gaze impassive, as if the gesture had no importance. She had won, that was a fact. But she knew that this victory was only the beginning, that the fight had only just begun. Their mistake wouldn't end here, and she intended to make it a turning point. The next day, after leaving the city and finding some semblance of tranquility on the train back to Paris, Zahara received a call from her superior at the Ministry of Justice. His superior's voice, usually calm and composed, had a note of urgency. "Zahara, they won't be able to hide this. An investigation is already underway, and those responsible will be suspended. This case will get bigger," he announced. Zahara closed her eyes for a moment, listening to her superior's words. She knew that this kind of incident could not be minimized, that the shock wave would be strong enough to shake the foundations of the system. But all this was only a first step. The real work remained to be done. The structure that allowed this kind of discrimination and abuse of power to take place needed to be exposed, deconstructed, and reformed. And that would not be an easy task. "Thank you," she replied in a deep voice, aware of the significance of her words. "But it's not over yet. I'll be following this closely. There's a lot more to do." His superiors seemed to understand. "We are counting on you for this investigation, Zahara. You have lit the spark of change, but the story is far from over." Zahara hung up, her gaze lost for a moment in the landscape passing before her. She knew that the path would be strewn with pitfalls, that there would be resistance at every step. But she had opened a breach, and like the wind that pushes a half-open door, she would make it widen. Montauban's story would be just one chapter among many in a struggle that, she knew, would last her entire life. But that day, Zahara marked a turning point. She had given a voice to those who, like her, had been silenced, and she intended to ensure that this silence would never be the same again.